Okay, so in the last video, we introduced what justification rationalism is. It's the claim that we have substantive a priori knowledge, and explained what that means. We then ran through the beginnings of the argument for that claim. The argument again goes like this. We know some forum's truths. Specifically, we're going to focus on modality. So we know some truths about necessity and possibility. Experience can't justify belief in those claims. Therefore, we have a priori knowledge of necessity and possibility. Some of that knowledge of necessity and possibility is substantive, so we have some substantive a priori knowledge. And in this video, we're going to run through this argument and explain why someone would accept the various claims. So why think we know some claims about necessity and possibility? Well, consider the following. Red here says, I would have been a bit taller if I'd eaten better as a kid. And blue says, I could have skipped class today. These are both modal claims. The claim on the left implies the following. It implies that Red's height isn't a necessary feature of her. That is, it implies that Red would still be the same person even if her height changed a bit. That's a modal claim, that she would have been the same person even if her height changed a bit. We could say, possibly, I have a different height, is what Red is saying. The claim on the right implies that being on time isn't a necessary feature of Blue. That is, Blue would still be the same person if he had been late. So it implies possibly Blue is late, or Blue could be late, or something like this. Or to put it in terms of necessity, Blue's claim implies it's not necessary that Blue is on time, and Red's claim implies it's not necessary that she has the exact height that she does. Plausibly, we can know the truth value of some such claims. You might at first be skeptical, but I want you to really think through that skepticism. If we can't know the truth value of any claim about necessity and possibility, then we can't know whether or not an individual survives a change. So, for example, we can't know whether or not you cease to exist when you cut your hair, or whether or not your body ceases to exist when it decomposes into dust. Why do I say that? Well, take the haircutting case first. Suppose you cut your hair. You have hair that's 8 inches long and now it's 6 inches long. Well, is it still you? If you say we can't know whether or not your hair length is a necessary feature of you, then you have to say we can't know whether or not it's you when you cut your hair. But then this seems to generalize, and you'd have to say we can never know whether or not something survives a change. So we can never know whether or not we're talking about the same thing in two cases. What about the body case? Well, the same general idea. Suppose we really can't know whether or not your body is still the same body when it decomposes into dust. Then we can't know whether dust and your body are the same thing. Well, that seems to suggest that we can never know whether any two things whether anything survives a change. It also suggests, incidentally, that we can never individuate things. We can never say whether a body and dust are the same kind of thing or different kinds of things. But let's let that pass. What I want you to see right now is just that if you deny that we can have knowledge of necessity and possibility, it looks like you must deny that we can know whether or not something survives a change, whether or not anything survives a change, which means you can never know whether or not you're talking about the same thing in any two cases. That seems pretty implausible, and correspondingly, it seems plausible that we can have modal knowledge. Okay, so let's look back at our argument here. We know forum's truths. That looks pretty plausible. It looks like it's plausible that we know some claims about necessity and possibility, including claims like I could have skipped class today and I could have been a bit taller and still be me, or I survived when I cut my hair. Now let's look at the second claim, that experience can't justify belief in these kinds of claims. So as I said, I'll elaborate on this later, but right now let's just say a little something about it. So let's take these two claims. I would have been a bit taller if I'd eaten better as a kid, and I could have skipped class today. What justifies belief in these claims? Well, it can't be experience. Why? Because you can't see, hear, feel, smell, or taste what would have been. Nor can you hear, feel, see, smell, or taste what could have happened, right? Whether Blue could have skipped class or couldn't have skipped class, whether it's necessary to being Blue that Blue be in class, or it's merely contingent for Blue that Blue is in class, either way, Blue is in class. The world looks just the same. And that is to say, you can't sense what could have happened. Similarly, you can't sense what would have been if you'd eaten more as a kid. You can use reason maybe to conclude that You would have been a bit taller if you'd eaten more as a kid, but it's not something you can sense because you can't sense what would have been. You can only sense what is. So perceptual experience, at any rate, can't justify belief in such claims. Okay, so we now have the first two premises justified. That is, we know forum's truths. Specifically, we've talked about modal truths, so we know truths about necessity and possibility. Experience can't justify belief in such claims, so we have a priori knowledge of such claims. It just follows. Now, why think some of that knowledge is substantive? I said it's intuitive, but let's just consider knowledge that P is substantive if and only if P is made true partly by the way the world is, and not just by your language and concepts. Well, if knowledge that you can survive cutting your hair isn't substantive, that is, if it's just about your language and concepts, then the fact that you can survive this change is just a fact about how we think and talk. It's not a fact about you. But then all facts will wind up being entirely about how we think and talk. They'll never be at all about the world. But that seems implausible. When I say the curtains are purple, it seems like that's a fact about the curtains, not just a fact about how I think and talk. One way to put this is, if you really reject substantive knowledge of necessity and possibility, it looks like you're committing yourself to immediately to a kind of radical idealism, the view that all that really exists is our minds. That seems like an implausible commitment to make just by rejecting necessity and possibility. So it looks like we want to accept that is substantive necessity and possibility. We want to accept that there are some substantive modal truths. And since modal truths can only be known a priori, it follows that there is some substantive a priori knowledge. Okay, so that's the argument for justification rationalism. Now let's look at what concept rationalism is, just very briefly. The major claim of concept rationalism is that we have substantive innate concepts. A concept is substantive, it's about the world, and a concept is innate if it's possessed independently of any experience. Now there's this exception, which I note here, which are triggering experiences, but let's just leave that aside and say the basic idea is that some substantive concept is innate, okay? That is had independently of experience. Notice this doesn't say anything about justification. It tells you about where your concepts come from, not about the justification for applying them in this or that case. Why would you think that there are some substantive innate concepts? Well, the standard kind of argument for this claim is what's called a poverty of stimulus argument. The idea is you show that the stimulus an organism has received is not sufficient to generate the concepts that it has, and it follows that those concepts must be innate. And then you say, well, some of those innate concepts are about the world, so you get substantive innate concepts. I'm not going to say more about this because really we're not going to talk much about this kind of rationalism, that is concept rationalism. But if you have questions in class, of course, we can talk about it. Okay, so we're going to stop this video there and continue next time by talking about empiricism.